This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
In the name of God, amen. We're continuing to read in course the story of the Hebrew people. And we come this week to hear of the birth of Moses, but we also hear some of the dynamics involved in that episode. If you will, some might say that the two Hebrew midwives were rather crafty ladies, since they refused to do as Pharaoh had commanded, and in fact, basically said, well, you know, those Hebrew women are just really a healthier bunch of women, and they give birth so quickly, we can't get there in time. So what are we going to do? But the real base and root of that whole encounter, all of that is happening there, is something we tend to not talk a lot about these days. It's called racism writ large, infanticide of another race because of fear and distrust and ignorance most of all. But it continues to raise its rather ugly head in this country, in Missouri and in Los Angeles and in Palm Springs. But we try at times to put, blinders on and shields on, and we even say things like, not in my backyard, NIMBY. Do you remember that phrase? Those kind of people? The Egyptians are very clear that they really don't want those kind of people anymore. But they choose to oppress them and treat them harshly. And yet, because of their relationship with God and their trust in God's omnipotence and love and mercy, they continue to thrive. And the issues of racism, which we pretend not to exist in some of our world, continues even now to exist. Not only here, but in other parts of the world. But it's here that it bothers me. And then we move on to the story, again, a great story, of Peter's confession. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Mr. Foot and Mouth Disease, the one who is always kind of blurting out, no filters, it just kind of comes out. Whatever comes out is what he thinks. And everybody kind of stands back and waits, including later on, when Jesus predicts his death and his rather brutal death on the cross. And Peter begins by saying, God forbid, don't talk about that. That can't happen to you. We won't let that happen to you. And of course, Peter, wonderful Peter, who represents all of us, denies Christ 3 times, as we do at times. But Peter does represent all of us. He is the one with warts on the end of his nose and flaws left, right, and center. And in spite of that, God calls him to be the foundation of the church, a recognition and a reminder that it is not because of who we are and what kind of degrees we have, but it is in spite of who we are that God calls us and loves us and offers us the abundance of his grace and mercy, time and time again. We Episcopalians kind of like to do the very intellectual thing and talk about all the theological premises on which the Christology of our theology exists, which means absolutely nothing unless there is a recognition first of a relationship with this Jesus. This Jesus who has come into our world and out of the abundance of God's love is willing to die for us. His compassion and love and mercy. Paul's writing in his epistle to the Romans speaks again about compassion and mercy and grace and all that is offered up for us. And a reminder, yet again, that it is not because of our brilliance and theological degrees, but it is in spite of all those things that we acknowledge who this Jesus is. It begins with a personal encounter, a recognition of Jesus as the Messiah, the one who has come into the world to save us all. And again, in spite of who we are, in spite of our prejudices and arrogance and all those other things, he continues to love us and embrace us and welcome us again and again. But of course, we like to play that game of my doxy's better than your doxy, or orthodoxy. If it's not this way in this diagram, it's, yours is not as good as mine, and I will show you how you splice this and dice this to make you acceptable to God. But the reality is, none of that really matters. Because the question that Jesus addresses to his disciples, and they, in their own fluster and tongue-tiedness, nothing that any of us ever have a problem with. Yeah, I did this morning at 8 o'clock. My mouth just wasn't working. But the reality is, he asks each and every one of us here, me included, who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? And if we have not answered that, and it's not about doctrine or dogma or theological precision, it's about the sacredness of that relationship and recognizing this one as the Messiah, the Son of the living God, who has come into this world to save us all. And it is about that relationship. That's the bottom line. It's not about prestige. It's not about degrees. It's not about how brilliant we are. But it is about our relationship and our willingness to follow and to offer the gifts God has given us for the upbuilding of God's kingdom here on earth and beyond. One of my favorite theologians is one Frederick Buechner. It's well worn. I realized the jacket was falling off at 8 o'clock. Didn't take it off. But Frederick Buechner wrote this book, Wishful Thinking, a Theological ABC, back in the 70s. And it remains one that I use often. But he says this, and I think it sums up well what I've been trying to say this morning. And this is his statement on doctrine. No matter how fancy and metaphysical a doctrine sounds, it was a human experience first. The doctrine of the divinity of Christ, for instance. The place it began was not the electric typewriter of some 4th century Greek theologian, but the experience of basically untheological people who had known Jesus of Nazareth and found something happening to their lives which had never happened before. Unless you can somehow participate yourself in the experience that lies behind a doctrine. Simply to subscribe to it doesn't mean much. Sometimes, however, simply to subscribe to a doctrine is the first step towards experiencing the reality that lies behind it. So the question is asked, yet again, in every generation, to each of us. Who do you say I am? Amen.